Hello, everybody. A couple of weeks ago, I saw a wonderful movie, Michael B. Jordan's Sinners. The more I think about it, the better it becomes. It gave Jordan two roles of a lifetime, and it's very much bound up in the mythology of the blues. He sold his soul to the devil in many ways. The old Faustian bargain, strongly recommended. And of course, the Faustian bargain is, I don't know what you call it, a metaphor, a trope, a model for how we think about the world. You only have to go online to read about one kind of Faustian bargain or another. There's Africa's Faustian bargain with the IMF, sounds very painful. There are, of course, all the Faustian bargains we're making with AI, the latest devil on the horizon. And then there's even the Faustian bargain that big tech made with a certain Donald Trump, which backfired. Trump, of course, being the other devil in popular imagination alongside Silicon Valley and AI. So we are doing our own show on Faustian bargains today with the author, appropriately enough, of a book called The Devil's Contract. Actually, it's called Devil's Contract. There's no the. The history of the Faustian bargain with Ed Simon. Ed had the book out. It came out last year, 2024, but it's about to come out in paperback. So, Ed, congratulations on the book. This seems to be, do we call it, you're a literary man, you teach literature at Carnegie Mellon in Pittsburgh. Sure. What do we call the Devil's Bargain? Is it a metaphor, a trope? What literary term do you use?
I use trope a lot in the book. One of the editors didn't like that, said that trope is an overused term, but I think it's a perfectly good word to use. I mean, there's a couple other things I think you could throw in there. It's perhaps an allegory sometimes, but doesn't have to be one.
Allegory comes to mind. Trope sounds a little academic, I have to admit.
Yeah, I think archetype works well. It's also kind of academic, but it's one of those recurrent themes that you see so very often that I feel like it can be graduated to an archetype.
Your book is a history of the Faustian bargain, which is mostly focused, I think, on the Faustian bargain in the European tradition. But I'm guessing, Ed, that ever since we've existed as a species, or at least we've been able to talk and tell each other stories, that there's been some notion of the Faustian bargain. Do you think that's true?
I think that's fair to say. I mean, I definitely think that, if you boil down the story to its kind of constituent parts, the idea of trading that which is of the utmost value or significance, be it a soul or whatever the soul is supposed to represent, trading that with some nefarious force to acquire powers or knowledge or wealth or what have you. I think that that's the sort of, I think that you do see that repeatedly and across cultures. And I'm not particularly an expert on things outside of the traditions that I write about, but I would not at all be surprised if you just see that story told over and over again, because it is such a beguiling kind of evocative story. And it says something about us as people.
Yeah, it's a bit of a miserable story, which may explain why the Germans love it so much. Is that fair?
I mean, it definitely. I don't know if I could comment on national character.
I could make stereotypes on my own show about the Germans.
Sure,
get away with it. I mean, I love Germans, of course, and Germany, but they tend to focus on the worst case rather than the best case scenarios, and that's what the Faustian bargain is all about, isn't it?
Well, I will say one thing is that one of the more optimistic versions is Goethe's version, where Faust actually, which is German, of course, where he finds a degree of salvation. Well, he doesn't find a degree of it; he finds salvation itself at the end. But certainly in its original permutations from the 16th century, the German folk traditions around Faust are pretty miserable, I think it's fair to say.
And I think in the 16th century, living in the countryside in Germany wasn't a lot of fun either.
Probably worse than the 17th, even, I would say.
I mean, lots of starvation and civil war.
For sure.
Going back to the original book, Ed, at least the original European book, the Bible, I'm guessing that there are lots of illusions, at least, soft Faustian bargains in the Bible, especially in the Old Testament, are there?
I think that's fair to say, and it's part of the argument that I make in my book. Is I am, interested in reading some works that are not traditionally thought of as Faustian because they maybe don't have the really literal kind of things we associate with the devil's contract, like an actual contract being signed or something. But for all intents and purposes, I think there's something Faustian about them. I mean, the story of the fall is a Faustian story in some ways, right? Where Adam and Eve eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil because of the temptation from the serpent in Eden. And as it was originally written, this obviously means something very different a long time ago in different cultural and religious contexts. But something about it, I think, has a kind of Faustian feel to it. Or you have the tale of Simon Magus in the book of Acts in the New Testament, where he doesn't sell his soul to the devil. He actually becomes Christian, but he becomes Christian in order to gain certain magical abilities, and then gets into major trouble for having done that. But that has that kind of feel of a conversion happening for supernatural reasons, right? Or for the desire to have certain supernatural powers.
I wonder if we wanted to give a good spin on it, or using the Adam and Eve example, whether rather than a warning, it's an opportunity to build the idea of good and evil. Is that fair?
Oh, for sure. I mean, I think one of the things that really drew me to this subject in particular is it's never just one thing per se, right? And you have this, tradition in Western, kind of an idiosyncratic position, but one that views the fall itself as being a fortunate thing. Felix culpa is what that is, a fortunate fall in Latin. So the idea that there's a type of freedom that is acquired from the fall. And that's certainly sometimes how the Faust legend is portrayed, particularly when we think of it in relation to the arts or music, right? That there's a certain type of creative inspiration, a kind of demonic energy that is liberating in some ways. So I think what makes these sorts of stories so powerful is that they aren't ever simple. There's never just one way to tell them, right? And I think we can definitely interpret the Faust legend in that way sometimes.
And of course, as you know, it's implicit, sometimes maybe explicit in the Bible with Adam and Eve. It's not surprising it gets picked up by later, shall we say, theological thinkers,
Sure.
like Christopher Marlowe, of course, the other Shakespeare. Tell us about Marlowe and his role in the history of Faust.
Yeah, I mean, Marlowe is really the most instrumental in introducing the story itself to an English-speaking audience. So as far as we know, I mean, we have stories of devil's contracts that precede the name Faust itself, but there was a historical figure in the 16th century named Johann Faust. He was a German necromancer. Magic was incredibly popular among Renaissance humanists. The historical Faust, whatever the details around him, and there's disagreement all across the score in terms of his biography, even who he was necessarily.
Yeah, I mean, it's supposed to be, according to Wikipedia at least, Johann George Faust, 1480 to 1540.
That's a very exacting kind of.
Yeah, I mean, that's
great.
Probably, well, that's Wikipedia for you.
For sure.
Even Wikipedia is an example of a Faustian deal with someone or other.
For sure.
I always used to tell Jimmy Wales about that, actually.
Yeah. But yeah, so there may have been, there's at least somebody that the story is based on, and he died. And, there were a series of Faust books, they were called, that were published that told tale of what had happened to him. And it was kind of a cautionary tale about, playing around with forces that are larger than your control.
Don't get above yourself. It's like,
exactly. Yeah. And then some
again, I don't mean to pick on the Germans, but a very German sort of thing.
Well, so they, Marlowe had access to these pamphlets because they were very short, and molded his play, his 1592 or 1593, around that particular narrative. And so Marlowe is really instrumental for introducing it to an English-speaking audience, and then also for kind of making it fodder for something that could be considered more elevated from a literary perspective than these earlier kind of tawdry, very lurid accounts of this supposedly historical figure. So really, Marlowe and then Goethe, a couple centuries later, are the main proponents, the main exporters of a particularly literary view of Faust.
Yeah, I want to get to Goethe later, but of course, when we think of Marlowe, we also think of Shakespeare.
Yes.
Are there Faustian elements to the Shakespearean corpus?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. One of the kind of pitches that I make in the chapter. So Marlowe is, and I'm an early modernist by training, and I love Marlowe. So he really dominates in my book quite a bit. And he probably appears as much, if not more, than any other cultural figure that I write about. But I put Marlowe's Faust, in conversation with Shakespeare's Tempest. Which is not exactly a Faustian play per se, but it does have magic, obviously, and it has wizards in it and kind of plays with those sort of occult themes. And I make an argument as to thinking of the Tempest as a kind of rejoinder or a rewriting to Faust, like a way to kind of give Faust the redemption that he is denied by Marlowe. But that's, maybe a kind of abstract way. In terms of actual devil's contracts, I mean, not exactly. I mean, I suppose if you think about Macbeth and his kind of interactions with the weird sisters, I mean, that's got a kind of feel of the Faustian about it, but it's not literally Faustian in the way that it is in Marlowe's play.
We certainly are attracted to not just the mythology of Faust, but the bargain itself. I've never quite understood the popularity of Lord of the Rings, but there's a strongly Faustian element there, isn't there?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. No, I think that, like, you see, and I think that you can see Faust a lot more when you kind of break it out of the rigid sort of like, the devil has to appear and you have to, like, prick your finger and sign the contract in blood. I mean, all of that stuff is sort of the more, superficial elements of the legend. But once you kind of get it out of that very regimented narrative, you do see Faust appearing everywhere. And I mean, I agree with you. I think Tolkien definitely has Faustian quality with it. I mean, if you think of Gollum being corrupted by the ring or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, Gollum, my daughter used to drag me. I've seen those films too many times.
Sure.
I think of Gollum and the Ring. I mean, that's as purely Faustian as you could ever get on every level.
Exactly, 100%. Completely agree with you on that.
Coming back to the Germans again, I'm going to be a little kinder. As you note, Faust picked up the Faustian idea in the early 1800s. I wonder whether there's also something a little bit more, shall we say, if not existential, psychological, or about it in the German tradition. When you think of late 19th century, early 20th century sociologists like Max Weber and his interest in the disciplining of the self, and his interest also in the history of religion, I wonder whether there's a particular German interest in Faust, and perhaps that's where the modern legend is born, because of its implications of self-discipline. I mean, certainly in the context of the Protestant Reformation and the work, especially of Martin Luther. How would you connect the Reformation and Faust?
Yeah, I mean, it's notable that, like, Faust, the historical Faust as well, is associated with Wittenberg, so the city of Luther, right? I mean, there's this kind of, I mean, in some ways, I think the Faust legend, even though there's devil's contract stories that precede the Reformation, is arguably a product of the Reformation in some ways, right? And I think this kind of focus on the individuality of Faust, he has a certain interiority, even in Marlowe's play. And I think that maybe speaks to what you were saying about in terms of psychology. I mean, in the ways in which Faust is oftentimes staged, I've seen versions of it, and I don't think that this is implicit in Marlowe's text, but you can certainly kind of add on to it if you want to. But I've seen versions where Mephistopheles is configured as something internal, like a voice within Faust, as much as a separate sort of figure as well. Because it is very much a play about divided intentions and kind of the psyche being against itself. Because Faust as a figure is somebody who continually does what he knows he shouldn't be doing because it's going to have negative repercussions for him. And he's somebody, especially towards the end of Marlowe's play in particular, where he is pining for this kind of redemption that he could embrace, but he doesn't, right? So he wants this thing that he is resisting at the same time. And I think that has a very nuanced kind of understanding of human psychology. And I think in Goethe, I mean, there's a continuation of that. But then Goethe's, closet drama, or however you want to categorize it, is also very much indebted, and in some ways kind of is the birthplace of a certain type of German romanticism as well, which of course also has that concern with individuality and experience and psychology and emotion and so on.
Yeah, that perhaps explains why at least the Faustian mythology or trope, whatever you want to call it, is much more popular in Northern and Southern Europe. I'm not sure how many examples you have from Italy or Spain or France. And it's probably not also surprising that, given that the Reformation was exported lock, stock, and barrel to North America, that the Faustian bargain has proved, or the idea of the Faustian bargain has proved, to have so much literary, psychological, cultural impact on America, as I noted in the beginning. Sinners is and the Blues, of course, are literally the musical version of Faust. When does Faust, so to speak, touch down in North America? Is it when the original Pilgrims came, Ed?
That's an interesting question. I think in a folkloric way, there's tales of Faust back to the 18th century in the United States. I mean, Marlowe as a figure and nobody theatrical for the most part, would have been particularly embraced by the Puritans. So it doesn't come in through that way per se. But I do think, you have stories like Thomas Moulton, who was supposedly a historical figure. He was a officer in the Revolutionary War, American officer. He's called the Yankee Faust sometimes. And one of the things that's interesting there is I think there's a particularly American type of version of the Faust legend. So in this story, and it's not like a high art kind of thing by any means, it's just kind of a fairy tale, but he sells his soul to the devil, whereby he gets to keep his soul if the devil can't fill up his boots with gold. And so Thomas Moulton puts out his boots, but he cuts holes in the floorboard. And so the devil dumps a bunch of gold in, and it goes into the basement or the root cellar or whatever beneath the house. And apparently the devil has a lot of gold, but still a finite amount. So he doesn't fill up the boots. And in this way, the Yankee Faust tricks the devil. So that's like a very, I think, not universally American thing, but a kind of a way in which it's a popular alteration to the legend. And that to me seems like a very American kind of rugged individualist, bootstrapping, kind of like wily trickster confidence figure who can, in the words of Chris Christopherson, maybe not beat the devil, but drink his beer, right? But that's got its own complexities to it. And in the Moulton story, the devil comes back and just burns down his house. So there's still repercussions for tricking the devil. You don't get out of it alive.
What about the implications for violence and, shall we say, intolerance and punishment? When you think of early America, you think of the witch hunts.
Mm-hmm.
Was there a sort of implicit thinking in terms of something like the New England witch hunts that these women themselves had done deals with the devil, and therefore it was the responsibility of the rest of us to exorcise them, to punish them?
Absolutely. Yeah. I think we have to completely think of the kind of fervor around people who are accused of being witches as being related to the Faust story. And that's one of the things I do in my book is I write about that in the context of the Salem witch trials, but then also witch trials more generally throughout Europe a little bit earlier than that. And a lot of times I think in the historiography or in the literary analysis, there's this division between the Faust legend and the story of witches supposedly selling their soul to the devil. But at the very sort of bare bones level, it's literally the exact same story. I mean, I think that division that's made is sometimes, Faust is this tortured man, and we kind of are so enraptured and captivated by that. But witches are dismissed because they're oftentimes, and most of the people who were persecuted were women. They're sometimes from the margins or the outside. They sometimes had less socioeconomic power or too much socioeconomic power, and accusing them of witchcraft was a convenient way to kind of get to the funds that they had. But I think with the story of the witch trials, we have an example of how a theme like the Faustian theme can be profoundly dangerous, right? This sort of story that is so fascinating wasn't just like an intellectual game necessarily, but had real material repercussions to the people who were erroneously accused of this thing that they weren't actually.
Yeah, and you brought up Macbeth earlier. It's sort of one step beyond. Macbeth did maybe made a Faustian bargain with the witches, but then in North America and the Salem witch trials, the witches there was no Macbeth, there was no mediating force. What about, Ed, particularly in terms of America, given its legalistic foundations and the role of lawyers everywhere? I've been married to two of them, so I'm very familiar with lawyers. What about the addition of the contractual element? Is that the thing that implicitly at least suggests that lawyers themselves are suspect? What do you make of the legalistic implications of the Faustian bargain?
Well, it's definitely not an American innovation for sure. I mean, the contract goes back as a part of the Faust legend to kind of the 16th century. I mean, there are these devil's contract stories that exist earlier that don't always necessarily have like the literal signing on the dotted line. But that is something that is pretty common after the 16th century, and it's definitely in Marlowe, it's in Goethe. And I think it's very important. I think it's part of what makes this legend a modern legend in particular, right? Because it's about bureaucracy on some level. I mean, it's about literally, the same sort of thing we would recognize in our legal system today of paperwork, of signing a contract in some manner. So I do think that the legal implications of this story in a kind of philosophical sense are really, really crucial. I mean, we do see them in, The Devil and Daniel Webster by Stephen Vincent Benet, which is kind of a classic American short story. It's literally like a courtroom drama in some way, right? And that's one of the things that I think differentiates the Faust legend from some of those earlier versions that we could talk about, right? I mean, the Adam and Eve story, whether or not we can say that's Faustian in some sense or whatever, Adam and Eve don't literally do paperwork, right? And so I do think that introduction of the contract is important with reconfiguring the story as a modern one.
Yeah, and of course, you could also incorporate capitalism into this, maybe in some of Marx's literary allusions. There's a Faustian element, and you mentioned bureaucracy. I think there's an element also in Kafka, who has exported that Middle European tradition to critique bureaucracy. So there's a great deal to it. I mean, my favorite modern book, which outlines the Faustian bargain, is Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. I mean, that is the most, in my mind at least, perfect warning about the Faustian bargain. What do you make of this book, and what are your favorite modern versions?
Oh, favorite modern versions. I mean, I love Oscar Wilde. I love The Picture of Dorian Gray, and I touch on it briefly in Devil's Contract. For modern versions, I really do enjoy Thomas Mann's novel from
another German.
Yeah, another German. Yeah, kind of a German fully aware of the implications of being a German too, which I think is what makes it
right. Yeah, I mean, given his history and what happened in Germany in the 30s and 40s.
For sure, yeah, and I think he was one of the things. I talk a lot about totalitarianism and fascism in particular as a type of Faustian politics. And Thomas Mann is such a fascinating figure because when he was younger, in the years after World War I, he had this, more than a flirtation with kind of far-right politics and wrote, very fervent kind of long, turgid screeds about, nationalism and this kind of embrace of the fatherland and whatnot. And then, of course, as a refugee from Nazi Germany, he became a very eloquent spokesperson for liberal democracy.
Yeah, we did a whole show actually on Man. And
oh, really? Yeah, it was recently. What was it his 150th birthday recently?
Yeah, there's a Man Institute in Los Angeles.
And yeah. And so I think that he one of the important things with Thomas Mann is he's aware of the allure of irrationalism, which a lot of what the Faust legend is, and one of the things I argue is that it's about giving in to a certain type of irrationalism, because the contract itself is clearly irrational. Like, if you know that the devil is real and that the devil collects souls at the end of your life, then like you'd never sign on the dotted line, and yet these characters continually do, right? So part of what I think Mann is so effective with is explaining why people don't act in their own best interest in that way.
Yeah, you mentioned your interest in totalitarianism. Of course, the most famous historian of totalitarianism is Hannah Arendt.
Yes,
she wrote a huge book about it, the book on totalitarianism. She was also embroiled in an enormously interesting controversy, as most people know, over interpretations of the Holocaust. Her book, Eichmann in Jerusalem, and with its notion of the banality of Israel, was enormous. Not the banality of Israel, the banality of evil. That was a Freudian error. Was enormously controversial in the way in which, for some people at least, she was transforming the Eichmann into a banal figure. Maybe the devil is banal. What would you make of that in terms of the history of the Faustian bargain? Is there debate about the morality of the devil?
Yeah, I mean, the devil is such a multi-variable cipher, right? I mean, he can be everything from a symbol of absolute evil to man's fallen depravity,
right. from a thoughtless bureaucrat in a mind to the pure evil of the Nazi death camp commandant. In other words,
think that you see a shift even in medieval depictions of the devil. The devil's not particularly frightening per se. I mean, in a lot of medieval morality plays, he's kind of a figure of fun. He's sort of just kind of stupid and this kind of farting, squawking, ridiculous figure. But then by the time of Marlowe, he is transformed into this like very sort of ultimate, absolute, terrifying figure. But you can read him through Milton as somebody who's seen as a kind of like figure of liberation. Not that Milton necessarily.
Yeah, and you wrote your last book was on heaven, hell, and paradise. Also, it's all about Milton. You know that stuff inside out.
Sure. But yeah, I think Hannah Arendt, the banality of evil as a concept, I think, is incredibly powerful. I think it was misinterpreted as her dismissing the reality of evil, and I actually think it's the exact opposite of that. I think actually her notion of the banality of evil, of its bureaucratization, is particularly relevant in contemporary America and ICE and all that sort of thing. Yeah, the one thing we haven't talked about yet, which I'm guessing is a particularly important piece of the history of the Faustian bargain, is sex and sexuality. We touched on Freud earlier. How central can or should sex be in the Faustian bargain, in the history of lust? I mean, we touched on Adam and Eve, which is a story of lust or of warnings about lust. I mean, it's implicit in there, or sometimes it's explicit, right? I mean, one of the things I think of in Marlowe, I always go back to Marlowe because it's probably my favorite historical version, but the demoness, the succubus who comes in the form of Helen of Troy, and that's that great line, was this the face that launched 1,000 ships that toppled the towers of Illyrium, from Marlowe, right? And I think that it's interesting because it's a depiction of lust in its purest form is separated from love, because, Faust is attracted to this simulacra, this person who's literally not Helen of Troy, but looks like Helen of Troy, and is a demon, is a succubus, right? and he knows that she's not actually Helen of Troy. So it's this kind of loveless sexuality, right? This kind of sex that is divorced from any type of human connection. And I think that that's oftentimes a recurring theme. I mean, in Mann's novel, for example, the
Dr. Faustus, his novel.
Yes, correct. Who's the composer, has his kind of fantasies of what he is seeing, these kind of demonic visions, because he's got tertiary syphilis and he's losing his mind, right? So we do have this kind of, sometimes puritanical understanding of sexuality that permeates the legend as well.
As it happened, I'm not sure these are connected. Hannah Arendt's father died of syphilis.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Maybe another Faustian deal somewhere along the line. You talked about simulacri, the appearance of something that isn't really true. What about these Faustian deals with things that don't appear to be alive?
Yeah.
I mentioned earlier AI, lots of pieces all over the media about how we're doing a Faustian bargain with AI, that it's promising something that will ultimately result in our own slavery. Is there a long literary history of this with the invention of smart machines? I know that, again, this was a Central European concept, and of course it comes out of the idea of the golem.
Yeah. No, for sure. I mean, I do think that kind of, the idea of artificial life being created by people and having negative repercussions is definitely a close sibling, I think, to Faust. I read about Frankenstein in the...
which is another very rich literary vein.
Exactly, yeah. Or a lesser known text, but one that's actually contemporaneous to Marlowe's play is there's something by Robert Greene, who was a playwright in the 1590s, called Friar Bacon and Friar Bungay. And it's about two mendicants that build a brazen head. So it's kind of giant mechanical magical head that answers questions, but it comes across very much like a computer, reading it in like a modern context. But then that's one of the things that I really deal with quite a bit in the final chapter of the book, is the ways in which contemporary technology and artificial intelligence in particular have almost what seems to me like a shockingly obvious kind of Faustian gloss to it, to a certain extent, right? I mean, so much of artificial intelligence seems like a classic Faustian, I mean, down to the magic of it, right? That you can conjure things out of nothing. You can have whole books and paintings appear that required seemingly no work. But then, what it does to us intellectually and economically and spiritually, right? Or ecologically, for that matter.
Or politically. I mean, I noted that big tech's Faustian bargain with Trump backfired. Right. Maybe big tech is as much a victim of this as the rest of us.
That's one of the things, too, is I think it's interesting that there's a lot of like mutual Fausts and mutual Mephistopheles, right? Like, I think sometimes everyone involved is kind of both of those figures sometimes. And I think that's something about like the negotiations between thieves when both sides aren't great. But I mean, I think that AI in particular is just tremendously Faustian. When I read about like the environmental damage of like the massive servers that they have, you kind of think to yourself, how could it get any worse than it already was, right? Like, in addition to the kind of everything that we can say right now that's disturbing about artificial intelligence, the fact that it contributes so much to anthropogenic climate change is just like one more damning thing about it, right?
And it's so much bound up in the casino-like capitalism of the early 21st century.
Absolutely.
Ed, I don't usually like to do this because there's too much spoken about Trump these days, but I have to end with him. Again, there's something almost absurdly Faustian about him. He could have been invented by a literary thinker, a professor like yourself. How would you interpret Trump in the history of Faustian bargains? Is he the ultimate Faustian figure? Is he the lawyer? Is he the guy we've done the deal with?
I think he's a tremendously Mephistophelian figure, I think he is the kind of demonic figure there. And it's so fascinating to me when you see all of these people who continually capitulate to him and then are surprised when he betrays
Even
them.
lawyers who generally are in the business of not capitulating, of capitulating.
For sure. And it's incredible. And it speaks, I think, to the fundamental irrationalism of those who think, well, I'll sign a deal with the devil, but I'll be the first one to win, right? I have a piece that I've written that hasn't come out yet where I talk about J.D. Vance, and I talked about J.D. Vance.
Yeah, Vance is a very, very good example.
Very Faustian figure. It's fascinating. I don't know how many years ago it was, but he's on record as having referred to Trump as being a potential Hitler, right? So Vance, he's a smart guy. He's fully aware of what Trump is like. Bless you. He's completely aware of the score, and yet he is willing to seemingly abandon whatever principles he may have had in the past and to kind of endanger his family, and to embrace this position for power alone. And like everyone knows that J.D. Vance is going to be betrayed by Trump someday.
Yeah, I mean, it's so obvious. I mean, exactly that happened with Musk. Well, let's end, Ed.
Yeah. Sure.
On some good news. What happens to Faust? Does he ultimately disintegrate? I mean,
depends on the
rather bad ending in The Picture of Dorian Gray. Can we hope for a bad ending to this?
I think he has a happy ending in Goethe.
He did? Or the
Germans? Yeah, I know, unexpectedly, right? This brief optimistic moment. I don't know. I think one of the things that I try to be, some of the criticism I've heard is the kind of like, if you the tendency to see everything as a hammer or something, right? Like,
if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail.
Exactly, that's it. Thank you. So I don't think that everything is a Faust.
In other words, if you've written Devil's Contract, everyone looks like Faust.
Exactly. I do think that there's something to be said with being aware of our own propensity towards irrationalism, right? And I think that the kind of like, how can we be tricked or how can we be fooled? And being aware of those weaknesses in our own soul. I think there's like a real power to that, the kind of cautionary warning of it. In terms of our own Faustian moment right now, what the end of that is, your guess is as good as mine in that regard.
Well, you've given us some good warning, Ed. Keep your distance from
anything
that looks too good to be true. Your book is now out in paperback, Devil's Contract, The History of the Faustian Bargain. Fascinating conversation. Thank you so much, Ed. And
thank you. Appreciate it.
Keep clear of Faust, because he or she will do you a great deal of damage.
Yes.